Hello everyone, it's Matt here. A few people have been asking me why I haven't done more live videos lately, so I'm going to remedy that right now because today is the 11th of April, and if you know your history, you will know that that's the anniversary of the first Battle of Bullecourt in 1917 in northern France on the Western Front. So I'm going to do a quick video. I'm going to talk about the history of that battle because it's one of the most significant battles that Australians participated in during their time on the Western Front between 1916 and 1918. So Bullecourt is a town up in sort of the Pas-de-Calais region, a little bit north of the Somme. And in 1917, the Germans had fortified the town and incorporated it into part of their formidable Hindenburg Line. Now, the Hindenburg Line was a series of trenches, barbed wire, pillboxes, just a really impenetrable position. And the Germans, after the fighting on the Somme at the end of 1916, had withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line at the start of 1917. So it's quite a cunning plan actually. It was they realised their line was too thin, it was too stretched out, it took too many troops to protect it, and it was poorly sited. So while they held their front line, they actually constructed behind the lines an even stronger position, a better position. And because it was built behind the lines, they had the opportunity to build it up as much as they wanted to. They could sight machine guns where they wanted to. They could build concrete emplacements without having to worry about building them in the front line. And then once it was completed, in the middle of the night, they withdrew to this new line. So the Hindenburg Line was this very, very heavily defended series of fortifications that ran all the way through the middle of France and up through the town of Bullecourt. So the key features at Bullecourt were two trench lines called OG1 and OG2. It was a holdover from Pozières, the fighting there. OG stood for Old German. So when the Australians saw two lines of trenches, they just referred to them as OG1 and OG2 as they had done at Pozières. So the Australians were tasked on the 10th of April with launching an attack on the Hindenburg Line alongside, it was the Australian 4th Division, and they'd be attacking alongside the British 62nd Division. Like always in these attacks, there was usually a poor old hapless bunch of POMs involved as well. It wasn't just the Australians, and this time it was unluckily the 62nd Division that would participate with the Australians. So they arrived at Bullecourt, and what had happened late in 1916 is for the first time the British had used tanks on the battlefield. These had never been seen in warfare before. They'd been used to varying degrees of success in the latter part of 1916 into the start of 1917. Most famously at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, tanks were used for the first time. Now these tanks were slow, they were difficult to maneuver, they had very poor visibility, they were poorly armoured, so they were susceptible to fire, and they were often breaking down on the troops, so they were very unreliable, these tanks. But the Aussies had about a dozen tanks that were going to support them during their attack on Bullecourt. And this was a bit of an experiment from the British. They weren't going to use the traditional heavy bombardment. They were going to use tanks. The idea is the tanks would go forward, crash through the German wires, cross the trenches. They'd be able to enfilade the trenches with machine gun and cannon fire and really open up the way for the Australians. It didn't work out that way in practice. On the morning of the 10th of April, as the Australians lay out in the snow, it had been snowing, just before dawn, there was no sign of the tanks. The tanks had gotten lost or broken down or gotten stuck in the mud. So hurriedly as the dawn light appeared, the commanders called off the attack, and they said that the Australians streamed back from their start lines like a crowd leaving a football match. So just imagine the chaos of the troops rushing to get back from their frontline positions before the dawn light caught them and that the Germans opened fire. So they staggered all the way back. They made the long march back to their billets and then found out, much to their shock and horror, that the attack had simply been rescheduled for the next day. So the Aussies again the next night, still having had no sleep, then had to drag themselves back from their rear positions back to the front line. They were exhausted by the time they got there. Now, they were waiting again for the tanks. The tanks were late arriving, but eventually some of the tanks did turn up, and the Australians began their attack in conjunction with these lumbering, slow Mark I tanks. The Germans opened fire as soon as they saw these huge lumbering beasts coming towards them out of no man's land. They opened fire with machine guns, they opened fire with field guns. Several of the tanks were knocked out very early in the attack. The ones that did make it got tangled in the wire, they would break down, they'd get stuck in the mud, and they became big targets for the German artillery. Every gun in the area was trying to blast these tanks off the face of the earth. So the tanks were not a good place to be, and they provided something of a problem for the troops because the tanks drew an awful lot of fire as they advanced forward. In spite of the problems with the tanks, the Aussies did the impossible. They managed to break into the German lines, into the OG1 and OG2 lines, which was an incredible achievement to break into the lines. But once they were in the trenches, they were going to have a hard time holding them because it was now fully daylight. The Germans knew that an attack was going on. All the tanks had been knocked out or broken down. The Germans poured artillery fire into no man's land, and effectively the Aussies who'd broken into these trenches were now cut off. We've seen this before. We'd seen this at Fromelles, most famously in July 1916, when the Aussies succeeded in breaking into the trenches, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because as soon as they got into the trenches, the Germans could cut them off. Exactly the same thing that happened at Fromelles happened during the First Battle of Bullecourt. The Aussies were cut off by shellfire in no man's land. They couldn't get reinforcements. The Australians in the trenches were now cut off from their mates back in their own trenches, and the Germans started pouring reinforcements into the lines. So you can imagine the Australians spread out in two lines of trenches, and those trenches the lines getting gradually compressed as Germans pushed in from all sides. And eventually, towards the end of the day, they realised that it was an absolute disaster and that there was no way they could hold those trenches without support. So their commanders ordered the men, as they had done at Fromelles the year before, to climb out of the German trenches and just make a run for it back across no man's land. And as you can imagine, the casualties were horrific. As soon as the Germans saw the Australians breaking from their lines, a hail of fire broke out and cut the Australians down as they rushed back across no man's land, trying to get back to their lines. So what was the result? At the end of the day, the Aussies are right back where they started. They'd lost 3,300 men killed, wounded, or captured. Most significantly, 1,170 of those men who were casualties had been captured by the Germans in the German trenches. It was the largest number of Australians ever captured in a single engagement during the war. So 1,170 Australians captured during that one day of fighting. No result whatsoever. The 4th Division was so badly knocked around, it was a long time before it could come back into the line. And the First Battle of Bullecourt was really an absolute disaster. There was a second battle that occurred in May, and it was more successful. It was ultimately successful at capturing across exactly the same ground. They didn't use tanks this time, they used a traditional artillery barrage. And in the second battle in May, they were successful at capturing the OG lines, but at huge cost. And all in all, the two battles of Bullecourt cost Australia 10,000 casualties. So the name Bullecourt from that day onwards became synonymous with the horrors of the First World War. It's definitely one of the half dozen or so most significant Australian battles of the First World War. And the men who were involved in the fighting at Bullecourt never forgot it. Especially that first battle, it was just a horrific situation, and the men never forgot it. And today, Bullecourt, when you go there's some wonderful sights to see. There's an Australian memorial park built on the site of that desperate fighting in the OG lines. There's a couple of memorials in the town to the Australians, but it's just a very somber place. It's one of my favourite battlefields to visit because it's virtually unchanged. There was a railway embankment, which was a pivotal feature. There's a sunken road. Those are both still there. And you can see the German lines very, very clearly because of the Australian Memorial Park, which is now there. And there's a wonderful sculpture of an Australian soldier in that memorial park. So it's really a beautiful battlefield to visit. It's quite a lovely battlefield. And it's like looking at a map when you stand there on the Australian start line. It's laid out in front of you. One of the first times I ever went to Bullecourt, I walked in the footsteps of the 4th Division in that first attack, and I found all sorts of artifacts still lying out in that field. I found a soldier's shoe, I found the sole of his shoe, I found lots of equipment, lots of bullets. It's just a battlefield that reeks of this incredible history. So if you're heading over to the Western Front, I definitely recommend you head over to Bullecourt, one of the essential sites that you will see on the battlefields. We included it in every one of our tours of the Western Front because it's just so important. But that battle occurred, 102 years ago today, the 11th of April. So it's an important day that we remember those men, particularly the more than 10,000 Australians killed, wounded, or captured during the Battle of Bullecourt. I hope you enjoyed this brief little video. There'll be more coming up. I've got some great things coming up. If you haven't subscribed to my podcast, please do. For those of you who don't know what a podcast is, it's like a radio show on the internet. Got some fantastic things coming up, including an interview, an evening that I spent with Eric Bogle, the folk singer, the wonderful folk singer who wrote that iconic song, the band played Waltzing Matilda. I spent an evening with him where he performed a couple of songs and told me all about his motivations and the history of those great songs. So that's coming up on the podcast. I've got some interviews with World War II veterans coming up, which is very special, and just heaps of great content. So please go and check out the podcast. You can find it on iTunes, you can find it on Spotify. Check out the podcast, subscribe, and listen to some great content. Keep tuning into these videos, and I hope to see you on the battlefields. Thank you. Bye-bye.